people touch that? Is that the...
Yes, there's some gloves here which I think if you like to have a little look through, feel free to flip through the pages.
We don't want a facsimile super spreader event, so be careful with the Beethoven. Hi, my name is James Lea. I'm a lecturer in music at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, and today we're going to be exploring Beethoven's late great quartet in A minor, opus 132, with Lesley Hatfield, David Adams, Scott Dickinson, and Alice Neary. First, we want to play quite a bit of the piece for you. It's a long piece, and so I want to hear as much of the music and as little talk as possible, so give you a little bit of context and then get the musicians involved quickly. This was one of three quartets written for commission from the Prince Nikolai Golitsyn, who was a cellist and asked Beethoven to write quartets for him in 1822. Now, Beethoven hadn't actually written a quartet for going on 15 years at this point, so it's a bit of an unusual request. He happened to request it around the same time that Beethoven started working on the Ninth Symphony, a slightly more important, as it were, commission that he was working on at the time. And so he postponed work on this, but did start doing some sketching while working on the Ninth, which has some significance, as we'll see. Beethoven then turned his attention very closely to this quartet in 1824 and into 1825, but was interrupted in the writing of it by becoming very, very ill, what he thought was a fatal illness. If you don't know much about Beethoven's health, more or less everything that could go wrong had gone wrong over the course of his life. It's still of interest to medical students today. What did Beethoven have? He had most everything that you could imagine. Some of it self-inflicted. Much of it self-inflicted over the last 20 years of his life, not really paying a great deal of attention what he was eating, and particularly drinking. And so in early 1825, he had to stop working pretty much entirely, and he submitted himself to the doctors, and the doctors essentially put him onto a detox diet. No wine, nothing interesting, bland soup, no spices, asparagus. And Beethoven resisted this even though he was deathly ill. He asked, "Can't I have spritzers?" No wine, not even diluted. Beethoven was adamant that he needed to continue to imbibe in his usual way, but he did stick to it. And the remarkable thing is, as ill as he was, he actually got better quite quickly. And in getting better quite quickly, was able to return to work and to complete this quartet. He never regained his full strength, and of course died within 2 years. When he completed this work, it was pretty much seen after his death that it was a very autobiographical work, as it were, very much centered on this illness. And the great third movement at its heart is titled Hymn of Thanks to God from a Convalescent in the Lydian Mode. And it's very much, I've come through this great illness, this great crisis, and am recovered, and this is the sort of musical response to that near-death experience. Beethoven himself had a pretty robust sense of humor, and this wonderful third movement, which is quite spiritual and is his hymn of thanks, is something that when he was writing to his doctor, he turned into a joke canon, which people have called a travesty. They can't bear to think that Beethoven could write some sublime music, heavenly, spiritual, far-seeing, visionary music, and yet turn it into a joke. But that was very much Beethoven. He's come through something. What did he do as soon as he came through it? He returned to eating things that he probably shouldn't have been eating. He returned to drinking more heavily than he should have been drinking. The illness produced maybe the greatest work of his career. Many people would argue that this is at the summit of Beethoven's achievement. The facsimile over there is very interesting because, as with many scores, it shows Beethoven's intense passion as he wrote. It is as if when you're looking at the page, you can see the musicians driving towards this particular cadence, or crescendoing in this way, or dying away. The actual graphology of the page tends to show the emotion of the music. The interesting thing, of course, is that that's something we can benefit from, but Beethoven never would have imagined anybody looking at and benefiting from. He would have thought everything depended on the music, including the autobiographical stuff that I've just told you. He would not have expected anybody to know this about him. The music should speak for itself. But it certainly helps us now, 200 years later, to understand some of the intimate aspects of this great music. In introducing it this way, I've talked about this in terms of music and health, and I focused on the third movement. And it's easy to talk about this quartet strictly from the standpoint of that movement, the extraordinary hymn at its heart. And people often do. The problem is that seems to represent the piece in its entirety, and that leaves out a crucial aspect of Beethoven's art and a crucial aspect of the art of Romantic music, juxtaposition. The modifying or affirming or undermining or denying or revising what we have heard but what we will hear, the complication of hearing in the present by what we've already heard in the past, and the need for the ending of all of this to resonate with everything that's gone before. The injunction of this work, is, as with all great works in classical music, is to never forget, to remember what you've heard before. The other thing to remember is the precision of all great art. Beethoven is often said to have pushed boundaries in these late quartets, that they were almost unintelligible to audiences at the time. It isn't true. These pieces were actually quite well received by the first listeners. Beethoven, throughout his career, is not striving for greater and greater fuzzy thinking, the ineffable, something beyond language, but actually trying to be more and more precise. He wants to pin down things like transcendence, wants to know precisely what despair means, precisely what experiencing joy in a messy world might mean. It's as if late in his career he realizes that as great as his career has been, some of his writing is yet still a little slack, still has moments of complacency, stops short in its analysis, doesn't quite say what he wants to say. And so he drives forward because, at least on one level, he's still searching for a grammar that allows him to pin down his emotions. And the real heart of this piece is Beethoven's career-long obsession with understanding and believing in this enlightenment path from darkness to light. He explores this path throughout his career in numerous works, most obviously in the Fifth Symphony, and most recently in the Ninth Symphony with its first movement, Near Apocalypse, and then its choral finale, the Ode to Joy. And it's in the immediate context of the Ninth Symphony that we should first start looking at the quartet, because in fact, the theme of the quartet's last movement actually emerges from sketches for the Ninth Symphony as an alternative theme to the Ode to Joy, as an alternative theme for the great last movement. And it's clear when looking at the sketches that Beethoven was actually having doubts about ending the symphony with a chorus and about ending it instead with grim, instrumental, unspeaking darkness. Other connections between symphony and quartet begin in their final movements coming with a recitative attached, with an instrumental version of speaking, invoking the voice. But then the symphony moves on towards the heavens, and the quartet seems to go at first really towards hell. But the quartet doesn't end there, and that's the essence of the work, the real question at its heart. What is the sound of happiness for an aging, dying skeptic? Can I write a happy ending in which I believe? Before we turn to the music, I want to think about a few famous responses by different poets and novelists to this work, because it's a much written about work. It's not just something that people analyze, but something that has deeply moved artists since it was written, and their responses try to rise to it. And the first I want to mention is Thomas Mann in Dr. Faustus from 1947. And he's speaking through his composer hero, Adrian Leverkühn, about this piece. And the composer says, by the way, there's also that incomparable finale. It really is annoying, that is, if you prefer not to call it delightful, that there are things in music, at least in this music, that cannot be characterized by an adjective or a combination of adjectives. Search as you will in the whole realm of language. I have been agonizing over the problem of late. You can find no adequate term for the spirit, the attitude, the gesture of that theme. So this is the theme from the last movement, the theme that was originally part of Beethoven's sketches for the Ninth. Have to imagine something like that in the context of the Ninth Symphony to see what a different work it might have been. The next response I want to look at is T.S. Eliot, first from a letter of his to Stephen Spender, written in the early 1930s, just as he is beginning work on his late great series of poems, The Four Quartets. And he writes, "I have the A minor quartet on the gramophone, and I find it quite inexhaustible to study. There's a sort of heavenly, or at least more than human gaiety about some of his later things which one imagines might come to oneself as the fruit of reconciliation and relief after immense suffering. I should like to get something of that into my verse before I die." And so it's clear here that he's thinking of the great hymn at the heart of this piece. And then staying with T.S. Eliot from a lecture given at Yale, again in the early 30s, when Beethoven was very much on his mind, he stated his desire at the time is to go beyond poetry in the way Beethoven went beyond music in his late quartets. And it's interesting to think about what he means to go beyond poetry, or for Beethoven to go beyond music. And one example in this piece, one example of what he means, is the entry to the last movement of this piece, which is a recitative. It's an intrusion. It intrudes upon conventional music. What it intrudes upon is a march. There couldn't be anything sort of more standard or basic. It's a beautiful march that Beethoven has written, but it's something that almost anyone could write. It is standard fare. And as something intrudes from out of the musical world, as it were, it seems as if somebody has run into the room and shouted. And this sense in late Beethoven, actually, that the concert space, that the concert piece somehow aren't enough, that actually the world is pressing in on the musical piece, is something that comes through over and over again in these late quartets, and particularly at this moment. So if we could hear this recitative. And then finally, I want to look last at Aldous Huxley and his novel from 1928, Point Counterpoint, in which he imagines a conversation between his characters Spandrell and Rampion. Rampion's a character based on D.H. Lawrence, as it were, on the third movement hymn. And Spandrell says, "You can't understand anything until you've heard this. It proves all kinds of things: God, the soul, goodness, inescapably. It's the only real proof that exists, the only one, because Beethoven was the only man who could get his knowledge over into expression. You must come. I want you to hear and confirm my opinion." And his friend answers, "But why?" And he says, "Because I believe in you, and if you confirm, I shall believe in myself." And eventually they listen just to the third movement, and his friend says, "Well, you're quite right. It's the most perfect spiritual abstraction from reality I've ever known. But why should Beethoven have wanted to make that abstraction? Why couldn't he be content to be a man and not an abstract soul? And Spandrel felt all at once tired and depressed. Listening had been a failure. Rampion had refused to be convinced. Was the proof, after all, no proof? Did the music refer to nothing outside itself and the idiosyncrasies of its inventor? And the scene ends with him dying by gunshot, and on the gramophone, the end of the hymn playing. And of course, that was possible then because it wasn't a long playing record. It would have been a 78, and so you would have had the different movements on individual sides. But it shows the problem with excerpting this extraordinary 15 to 20 minute movement from the middle of this piece and treating it as if it's a vision complete. It is part of a total response to Beethoven's illness and understanding of music at the time, which finally ends with a different kind of transcendence, a sort of quieter, more private moment, as we shall see. Beethoven does not end his work with the end of the hymn. The drama has some way to go. So let's look at this drama now, going back to the beginning of the piece and working our way through. The first movement is in a sonata form, and the sonata form is, of course, the great classical form of sort of rationalizing difference, of having very different things, but bringing them together and working them through. If that's the case, then this is very much a failed sonata, this first movement. We have anguish to begin with, and we end in despair. Nothing is worked through. Opposites are not reconciled. It is actually, in its intention, an inversion of the sonata form. Pain exists to begin with, and then the pain persists. It is one of the most changeable sonata forms you will ever hear, in the sense that everything switches on a dime every few bars. We have very mysterious chant-like music. We have march music. We have aria, recitative, cadenza. It is anything you can imagine. It is extremely difficult to pin down, and we'd want to go through this a little carefully so we can hear these different aspects. So first, the first 8 bars, and notice how strange they are and also how terse. If Alice, you could play the first 4 notes, it's a rising semitone answered by a falling semitone. Now, the second 2 notes she played are F down to E, and those are crucial notes throughout the entire piece, not least in the hymn and then in the last movement. It is as if on the very first page of the piece, Beethoven is introducing something really important that's going to happen, but he slightly disguises it because there's an entry on top of that. So we don't hear it clearly. It's not as if we know exactly what will happen, in the same way a good storyteller would hide to some degree their intentions. So if we could have the opening 8 bars now. And then after that mysterious opening, we immediately go into a cadenza. So I think, what does this opening have to do with the cadenza following it? Why does this music follow that? And then as we leave this cadenza, we'll head into a little march tune. And again, the music doesn't settle. It doesn't settle into a stable theme. We don't get a nice tune that we can sort of remember. It's contrapuntal. It's skittish. The music keeps changing. So if we could first hear the cadenza. And then if we can go into the next section when this main theme sort of emerges, but in such a way that we're not really certain that we're hearing a tune. try as it might, the theme can't get going. As soon as the musicians seem to be gathering momentum, we have another cadenza that you've just heard. And so before we've really even established this as a tune, the music starts moving on towards the next key area and the next theme. Players continuously find common rhythms, and then those rhythms sort of scatter apart. And I want you to notice how much in the transition that we change as we're heading towards the new key. It's not much different than what we've just heard. The music is inherently unstable. And after all of that, we actually reach the key of F major, and it seems almost as if we've rather happened upon something, as if we found something in the forest, something incongruous, something in this context which seems almost impossible to believe. We now are going to have a singer standing in the midst of this, singing, seemingly oblivious to the dangers surrounding them. And it's important to note that the key we found, F major, will later be, in the guise of the Lydian mode, the key of our hymn, the great third movement. Third movement, yes. If you notice at the very last two bars, we have returned to the opening. We've got these dotted rhythms again, dum, ba-bum, 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 bum, and then the chromatic minims. So even though we found our way to this happier place, actually the sort of terror of the opening has not let us go. So if we could now have the end of the exposition. So Beethoven at this point has written one of the most disruptive expositions you would have heard in music up to 1825. If the point of a classical movement development is, especially a Beethovenian classical development, is to up the ante, as it were, to make it more intense, he doesn't have a long way to go. There's not much room to do that. And so the opening of this development is quite odd. It begins with this opening mystery. We have the march rhythm. We don't have the cadenzas, but really not much is happening. It doesn't push it forward. And then a kind of frenzy is worked up. But it feels more as if somebody's working themselves up to something, as if the real emotion weren't there, as if there's a form of something not truly felt, as if it should be forced because that's what's expected. And so the truth of this is revealed when the music stops, as if the passion can't be faked. And the music is near, as it were, collapse. It doesn't seem to know where to go from here. sort of chasm opens up at that point and completely it leaves you hanging, not knowing. And it's as if Beethoven is not quite sure where we're going to go from here. The most naturally contrapuntal of genres ends in this moment of silence. Nobody is speaking. This whole idea of the quartet, of four people getting together socially and talking to each other, it's as if this has been obliterated. And so what happens is the musicians try to refine themselves. They try to work something back out. And something does sort of emerge from this. And what happens is an eruption, a pretty heroic statement of the opening theme. Mysterious no more. This is not sort of chanting in the distance, not chromaticism as mystery, but noonday sun, looking at it and finding that actually it is painful and hurts. The menace is fully present. What was creeping up on us has now found us. But interestingly, this has found us in the wrong key. This should be the moment of recapitulation in a sonata form, which means we return to the opening in the key we started in. In this case, we haven't. We're not in A minor at all. We're in E minor. But the unusual thing is we now do traverse everything we heard in the exposition again in the wrong keys. And then we do it again. So if this is a working through, if sonata form is supposed to be taking an idea, looking at things that are quite different and working them through, this is the opposite of that, an emblem, as it were, of frustration. We keep doing the same thing obsessively over and over and over again, not getting anywhere. So we go through all of this E minor, moving to C, same tunes, very slightly modified, and then we have a shortened version again in A minor. Focused, everything has been winnowed out, just the bare bones. Even the aria that we heard at the beginning, the F major moment in the forest, becomes heartbreaking, a little window of light quickly swept away. The first violin eventually goes to the same pitches over and over again, D, C, before going back to that F, E we heard at the beginning, in a high, high register, screaming. The opening cello whisper now becoming a cry of pain. And then finally the violin trilling on F, E, and then finally repeating nothing but E's until the movement crashes to its end. I think, given the time, if we maybe play from 223 and just play through to the end at this point. A good sonata form is like any good genre. It provides assurances, like knowing the hero or a heroine in a serial is not going to die. We know James Bond is going to pull through no matter how bleak it looks. But this sonata form doesn't deliver. If we begin in confusion, then we end in despair. The assurances that were provided were not followed through on. Beethoven has undermined this. He undermines that with the second movement juxtaposition, which couldn't be further from what we've just heard. It's a minuet in A major. Not only that, it's a minuet that's very closely bound up to Mozart. Mozart from, at this point, nearly 40 years ago, the A major quartet from K464. That is a very long time. We think of Mozart and Beethoven being both classical composers, but if you think Beethoven is now very much in a witty, contrapuntal, urbane idiom from the 1780s after we've just heard this very contemporary expression of pain. It shows you how disruptive this music was meant to be at the time. It was meant to actually, as soon as you settled in one thing, you were completely switched to a different mindset entirely. This movement, in its way, is as obsessive as the first. We have a very simple opening statement, the first 4 bars, with the musicians moving in lockstep together. But then in bars 5 and 6, we have a bit of double counterpoint. In the first violin, and the second violin. And those 2 little bits of music are all you're going to hear for the next 10 minutes. Every single bar has a combination of those things. It is as if a maths professor has sat down and is really working through every detail that's necessary of a very complicated proof. That makes it sound academic, it's fun, it's light. You couldn't imagine anything more different from what we've just heard. We don't really have time to hear that now, but when you're listening later in the concert, do notice that. Now, one thing I do want to point out in this movement is also the trio. The trio, if this section is really urbane, witty, clever, contrapuntal, a composer at the top of his craft, the trio in this movement is total simplicity without guile. It's again almost how can innocence emerge within this context? We've had very adult pain, and now we have very professional dancing. And now we have something that seems almost childlike. And it is, again, Beethoven turning back to his youth. He borrows a theme, an allemande for keyboard that he had written 30 years before. And he puts it into the context of this piece, this very different music. So it really is Beethoven reclaiming his past. And it's a reminder that despite the kind of chaos Beethoven lived in, despite the number of homes, the different flats he moved in all the time, despite the fact that oftentimes he was in a state really of squalor, he kept his sketches from when he was very young. Every single piece of music that Beethoven had written or thought about, he kept very closely and referred back to throughout his career. And this is evidence of that when he goes back to an idea from 30 years previously. And then we return to the urbane world of the minuet. And now we come to the great movement at the heart of the piece, the Heiliger Dankgesang, the hymn in the Lydian mode. And just so you know what the Lydian mode is, it's a scale. It's basically a major scale with a sharp 4th degree. So Lesley will play that. So you can hear in the middle of that scale a quite unusual pitch. If you want to play that one more time. And And what that means is that, and Beethoven doesn't use any notes apart from those in the scale. There's no chromaticism in this opening section at all. It's just those. It's a page of pure sort of, as it were, on the piano, white notes. There's nothing other than that, until we move into the next section. And this great hymn is contrasted with a section entitled Feeling New Strength, which is again a piece of sort of contemporary joy and urbanity. It's as if it's a different world, imagine, one in which Beethoven is very comfortable, very happy, very healthy, and in fully, embracing life, as different from this ethereal hymn as possible. And the form of the movement is hymn, feeling of new strength, return to the hymn, feeling of new strength, virtually unchanged, and then finally hymn again. So 5 great sections. And the hymn itself is in 5 phrases. It's very much a church hymn. And each of those 5 phrases has a little prelude or interlude that introduces it. So it's very much, if you imagine sort of Bach chorales, you sort of have a little bit of introduction and then the hymn proper, and then that's got more linking music 5 times. On top of that, Beethoven extends the speed of this ridiculously. He sort of stretches it out. It's almost unplayable for 4 musicians. It's something that a string orchestra might, ease through. But for 4 musicians to sustain this is really, really daunting. And that kind of poignancy and fragility is part of the point of the music. It should be a struggle. What I want to do is hear the musicians play the hymn without the little interludes at sort of double speed, so you can actually hear that this has a tune, because when it's going so slowly as it is in the actual music, you might miss the fact that there's a tune there. Actually rounded that off nicely in C, which is where the music keeps wanting to go because of that raised 4th degree. B wants to go to C. That's not what happens in the music, and we'll hear in just a second what does happen. Maybe for time's sake, if we could just play the opening phrase with the actual prelude into it, just to hear how it properly goes. And then if we could just play the last phrase again, moving into the new strength section. And when you hear this transition from the hymn to new strength, it is something of a miracle. It does feel as if the weather has changed completely, and this person has, as it were, emerged from their illness into full, robust health. So maybe from 26. So we have this a couple of minutes of really joyous music before we then return to the quietness of the hymn. And it's not just the hymn in the same way. There is a little bit more rhythmic motion. What Beethoven introduces is more motion, quicker note values into these little preludes. And what you'll hear initially is that in this section, the first violin, Lesley, is the only one that has the hymn tune. Everybody else has these little counterpoints. The interludes, the preludes, are now accompanying the hymn. So perhaps we should just have Lesley play the opening phrase of the hymn, just so you can hear that, and then play together.
As it goes in the second.
Yeah. Maybe if we can have that again with everybody.
For the beginning of the...
Yeah.
Oh, now we go.
One more time.
So we go through all 5 phrases of the hymn again in this setting, and then we return to the next new strength section. And it's very, very similar to the previous one. And then we come to the great climax of the piece. Where else do we go? And Beethoven reduces the hymn at this point. It's been 8 notes. He reduces it now to 5 notes. And he starts treating it more like a fugue. And then there's overlapping entries. And so instead of having complete phrase statements, the musicians overlap in their treatment. And so if we can just, maybe we'll skip to that and just play the opening statements of the hymn.
From 170.
Yeah. And so that's the heart of it. And around that are now further diminutions of what we've heard before, faster note values of the previous themes, all intermingling. This builds up into one of the great climaxes in classical music, not only in Beethoven, but in all of music, one of the great pages. You should really only hear that in the context of hearing the entire piece, I think. It really should build up and be emotional. So we will save that for you later. We turn then to the very, very brief 4th movement. And again, it's as if everything we've just heard has got to be switched off and we have to turn to something completely different. Again, a very, very worldly piece, a little march. It couldn't, again, be anything more different from what we've just heard. If this was the most ethereal, spiritual music of Beethoven's career, this is absolutely worldly, almost banal. Good music, but pretty standard after what we've just heard. So let's hear the opening of the march. This march is very brief. After the enormous length of the Heilige Dankgesang, it's only a couple of minutes before, as we heard the first bit of music we were really hearing today, the recitative, the passionate utterance sort of comes from out of somewhere else and cuts this off, and we're suddenly in a different territory entirely. And then we enter into the last movement, and it's important to note that we have recitative and then aria. It's very operatic in that sense. We do sort of, it's as if the music almost wants to speak, almost talk to us. The last movement is intense, passionate, very much returning to the beginning of the work, as if those things that we didn't work through were still there. Despite this heavenly vision, despite the sort of worldly, urbane major movements, we actually have not forgotten and have not left behind the pain and the passion of the opening. And it becomes clear that the music is on a knife edge. It's either going to end in darkness or despair, or some sort of hope might be found. And Beethoven opts for the latter. He actually finds near the end of the piece a way to shift finally from A minor to A major, to leave behind the passion and the pain. And so what would be good is actually just to perhaps turn to that last bit where we're ramping up the speed, the sort of crescendo and poco a poco up to the prestissimo, and then finally to the A major section. Maybe from...
Which one?
Sorry, no,
Do you mean 266?
266, yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Sorry. 1, 2, 3.
Yes, and so we whip ourselves up into this frenzy, and as you can hear, we just suddenly shift to A major. It's as if we are surprised by happiness, as if it's taken us unawares. Not something that we've earned or have a right to, but that comes upon us, something to be cherished and grateful for. Maybe we now have to play some of that A major just to give us a little bit more taste as we go towards the end.
Just from 299? 299.
Which? 299?
Very good. And maybe we could just have the very last few bars of the piece, from 351 perhaps to the end.
51.
51. And if you go back to thinking of this as being a kind of counter to the Ninth Symphony, as a sort of a piece that's emerged at the same time as the Ninth Symphony, but looking at the way to find a happy ending in a different way. Perhaps the communal shouts of the Ninth Symphony were found wanting in the aftermath of Beethoven's personal trauma, his near-death experience. What's left is not this sort of big communal feeling, but more a sense of individual hope. fragile. Make no mistake, the last movement, as the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, is very much about how Beethoven was looking to find a grammar for affirmation, how to make affirmation plausible, found just how much we're willing to believe, how much pain we can take along the way, and yet still find hope and still believe in earthly joys. Thank you.